The gingerbread broke cleanly in her hand, a jagged crescent of brown sugar and molasses that left a powder of crumbs on the rough linen of Maya's apron. For a second she held it reverently, as if it were worth more than the morning's wages, and felt the small, hot rush of joy that came from thinking of Eli's small fist closing around a cookie with the same fierce possession he showed her when she came home with a yellow balloon. The kitchen around her hummed with practice and distance. Silver trays steaming under domed lids, a chandelier turning the cream of the room to pale light, and the perpetual cool presence of things that never belonged to her. Mrs. Lucille Granger stood 3 steps away, the hem of her starched sleeve flicking crumbs off an immaculate counter as if clearing a fault line. Her voice was the sound of someone folding authority into every sentence. "Maya," she said, slow and sharp, "we do not take food from service areas. Do you understand me?" Maya tensed, feeling the shapes of those words fold over her like cold water. She had been careful enough to slide the broken edge of gingerbread into the corner of her apron where the stain would look accidental, careful enough to tuck a hand to her shoulder where the day's ache had already begun. Eli had asked if she could make macaroni like she used to, and she had promised with the absolute certainty of a small person given the tilt of a weeknight. "You will be home Sunday," she had told him. "We'll have something small, a cookie." She had been folding that promise into the hollow of her day, carrying it like a private ember inside the noise of plates and polish. Lucille's eyes found the ragged line of crumbs. The kitchen stopped briefly, only the way air stops before a wind breaks. One of the young men who turned the oven knobs looked up and then away. The chef, a large man who spoke in the low music of men who were never asked the small things, kept his hands on a pot and pretended the moment belonged to someone else. "You know better," Lucille said. Her voice did not rise. It cut. "There are rules in this house. We are not here to be sentimental. Hand it over." Maya's fingers tightened without thinking. "Mrs. Granger, please." The cloth came away. Lucille pinched the remaining cookie between a careful finger and thumb, inspected the cracked edge, and then, as if testing a seam, flicked crumbs onto Maya's apron. The action was small but public, precise humiliation. "Save your talk, Maya. You will clean the pantry tonight, and you will do it right. If I find anything missing again—" She left the threat unfinished, like a door left open. Maya felt the room revolve slightly around that unfinished hinge. Her shoulder, where she'd reached up to a high shelf an hour earlier, ached now with a white, insistent prickle. She blinked and tasted salt, not from the kitchen, but the thought of Eli being awake and waiting, and a bowl that would not taste like much if she could not be there. "Do it tonight," Lucille repeated, and the kitchen resumed its mechanical life. Pans clanged, a timer trilled. The oven exhaled warm, clean air that smelled of butter and citrus and a world where people were inside and not behind the counter. When the shift finally eased, Maya stayed longer than she should have, washing a stack of china until her knuckles went pale. She wrapped the cracked cookie in a square of wax paper and tucked it into the pocket of her apron like contraband. She thought of Eli's face when he bit into the edge. Did he have the habit of skittering his thumb across the gum line the way she did? Would he save the middle and hide it in his small palm? It mattered, the way small things do between a mother and a child, the promise that they remember one another. Outside, the grounds were silver with a fine frost. The Hartman house sat like a ship on an artificial sea of lawns, grand, unyielding, and lit as if celebration were a duty. Maya walked past the servants' gate, past the low brick where she kept her shoes, down the path toward the service entrance where the drivers waited. Patrick, in his navy jacket, was there with the van idling, breath clouding in short puffs. He watched her come with a look that was only partly curiosity. Mostly it was the expression of someone who had learned, over years of chauffeuring different households, how to read a person's fatigue. "You look like you've been closing a battle," he said when she climbed in. He had the flat, gentle voice of a man who listened to the radio to drown out the soft edges of other people's stories. Maya gave a tired laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Just a long day. Patrick glanced at the sleeve of her uniform, the faint darkening near the shoulder. "You all right?" he asked. The concern was plain and practical, less pity than a question that needed an answer because someone should know. "Fine," she said. It came out too short. She had learned to make fine a place that would not invite more scrutiny. She had learned the exact ways to be invisible, to fold small complaints so they would not take up space and cost the house another minute. At home, the narrow row house 3 blocks from the expressway, where the walls were papered with years of small drawings, Lorraine had hung a wreath that leaned slightly to one side. Lorraine's hands had always been steady, from the way she patted dough to the way she folded the bedsheets. She had been a steady anchor in the tumble of Maya's life since Eli's father left. Her voice, when Maya stepped through the door and the scent of simmering tomatoes hit the air, had the soft steadiness of someone who had learned to breathe through storms. "You're late," Lorraine said, but it held more relief than reproach. Eli's shoes were scattered by the door, a small fortress of plastic dinosaurs. When Eli saw her, he ran. His arms were a brief, hot band around her hips, his face slack with the honest joy of a child who had nearly believed the evening would go another way. "Mommy," he said, as if naming was a spell, "did you get the balloon? You promised." Maya laughed. "Not this time, Angel, but I brought you something." She unwrapped the wax paper on the kitchen counter. The gingerbread, now a neat crescent, held the memory of warmth. Eli's eyes widened. "For me?" "For you," she said. He took the cookie like it was a treasure, and bit, the way children bite without measuring consequences. Crumbs landed on his chin. He chewed slowly, deciding whether the world would be different for a single sweet. "Is it good?" Maya asked. "It's perfect," he said, as if he had appointed her a small miracle worker. He licked his thumb clean. Maya let herself rest there, the corner of her mouth soft with a grief that had room in it for this small victory. That night, while Eli slept with one small fist flung to the air, and Lorraine hummed old hymns under her breath in the kitchen, Maya lay awake on the narrow bed and whispered a question into the dark. It was quick and modest, no petition for fortune, no request for a new life. "I wish," she said, low enough that even her own breath could not carry the sound, "that this year we could sit at a table and have our own dinner, a real plate for Eli, just once." It was not a prayer. It was the kind of wish that fits into the small, fragile cabinet of human wanting. She did not say it aloud to anyone. She held it the way she held the gingerbread, careful, private, like something too precious to risk. If any ear had been listening in the house where she worked, the billionaire who owned it did not hear. Tobias Hartman did not stand in the hallway and catch it as it left her mouth. That would have been a romantic line in a storybook, a clean arc, the wish overheard, the rescue enacted. But life more often bends quietly. Opportunity arrives through forms and reports, through the slow mechanisms of organizations and the human people who staff them. And so the wish remained hers alone in the dark. The next day, her shoulder had given a sharper complaint. Small tasks felt like climbing, rinsing pans, lifting linen, stretching to the top shelf where the china hid the good plates. When Lucille barked about a smudge on a serving platter, Maya's hand slipped on a cloth, and some hot water nicked her wrist. She gritted her teeth, pulled the cloth tighter, and forced herself to finish. Pride and labor had a backbone. She had never wanted pity. But 2 hours after the dinner shift, she found herself moving less as an act of will than as a body in motion under the direction of routine. On her way out, she bumped against the pantry door frame, a small, stupid misstep. A jar slid and clattered, scattering lid and glass. She stooped to pick it up and felt a thin, tearing pain along the top of her shoulder, as if something had been put out of order inside her body. She swallowed a curse and straightened, pulling the janitor's cart to hide the sudden white line of pain from others. The muscles in her shoulder tightened like a fist. Patrick came by at the van with the other drivers and saw the way she moved. His questions were not loud. They were the kind that made space for an honest answer. "You should let someone check that," he said. "We can put it on the log." Maya kept her face steady. "No, I'll be fine." "You keep saying that," he said. "People don't need to be fine all the time." It was not the kind of argument Maya wanted. She had bills, schedules, the quiet rules of a worker's life where complaints translated into fewer shifts and fewer checks. But Patrick's words lodged in the space between her ribs. He did not press. He wrote something on a small slip of paper and pressed it into her palm. A number for a neighborhood clinic, and, on the back, a name, Denise Paulson, Savannah office. Maya did not call. She washed her uniform and went home and filled the sink with hot water and watched Eli splash and giggle, and the small, beautiful normality of the scene made the idea of burdening someone with her ache feel wrong. If she left the house for a doctor, who would watch Eli? Lorraine's hours were already long. She nodded at Eli, made him pancakes, and tucked a warm cloth over the small ache as she might tuck a child into bed. The next morning, an envelope had been tucked quietly into the slot on the staff notice board, the paper that normally held memos about schedule changes and pantry inventories. It was a plain white envelope with no handwriting on the outside. When she slid a finger under the flap, she found a single sheet folded with great care. Inside was a short note and a small check for 2 weeks' wages, and the words, "Take the time, we'll cover this. S." Maya's first response was disbelief. She checked the name. There was no signature she could match to anyone she knew. The check had the company's name printed neatly at the top, Hartman Domestic Services. There was no grand flourish, no donation slip, no fanfare, just a small act of practical kindness that read, in plain type, like a pause granted. She stood in the dim staff room with the sheet in her hands and felt as if someone had taken the breath from inside her and then let it go again. The check would cover Eli's childcare and a little food. The note might have come from a benevolent member of staff who had seen her limp and decided to act, or from the house's formal welfare committee that maintained a small emergency fund for workers. She could imagine Patrick passing along the story over coffee and someone in the steward's office saying, "File it, let's not let this linger." Or Denise could have received the brief incident report Patrick had promised to write and moved a few internal levers. Whichever mechanism had been used, the result was the same. She could go home, rest, and the world would not immediately tumble. Maya folded the paper and put it in her pocket as if it were a talisman. She did not tell Lucille. The thought of Lucille's arch, unreadable face had already cooled the stirrings of revenge in her chest into something quieter. She did not want a spectacle. She wanted, very quietly, to heal. On the bus home, holding the envelope, she thought of the little table she imagined in the corner of a rented hall, or in their tiny kitchen. Mismatched plates from the thrift store, a blue candle, Eli sitting on the chair she had painted with stars the summer he was born. She thought about how quickly such a simple thing could be called extravagant in a life threaded with bills. She thought about patience, about the slow architecture of change. That evening, Patrick drove them. He refused to take money for the fare. "Just be careful with that shoulder," he said, a man whose hands knew the wheel and the weight of other people's hurt. Home smelled like cinnamon and old paperbacks. Lorraine had called in the favor of a neighbor who was closing an extra pie and left a dish of stew to warm. The table, small and round, had been cleared and set. It was the sort of table that had a history, a chip where a knife had once slipped, a burn mark like an old fault line. It was imperfect and therefore entirely theirs. Eli ran a little procession around the legs of the table with a wooden soldier that made a sad, determined clack when it hit the floor. He put the plate, one of the mismatched thrift plates, into the center. "Mommy, sit," he said, as if the act of asking could anchor them for the night. They ate slowly. Maya let herself be small in the way very loved people can afford to be. She laughed too loudly at a joke about the cat. She told Eli a story about a pirate whose treasure was a jar of pickles, and when he dropped his spoon, she scooped it up without thinking about the cost of spoons and the future. The gingerbread remained on the counter, a memory and its own proof. At some point, Lorraine reached and squeezed her hand, the only words necessary being the pressure of an old, steady presence. That night, after Eli's forehead had cooled and he had fallen into the heavy, dreamless sleep of small children, Maya sat at the window and felt a small ache, both in her shoulder and in the shape of her life. The envelope had given space. Space was a strange and generous thing. You could not buy it with large gestures. It came as time, as breathing room, as the ability to think past the next bill. A message arrived the next day on the small flip phone she owned, a line of text from an unknown number asking if she might come by the Savannah office for a brief interview about a staff welfare initiative. It was signed, simply, D.P. Maya stared at the message until the letters blurred. Savannah office, the company that handled the Hartman Foundation's staff programs, was a place she had only ever imagined in the sharp angles of the wealthy. Glass and nameplates and the glossy confidence on a mid-level executive's face. She had no formal education beyond the courses on sanitation and etiquette the agency had offered, but she had something else. The carefulness that comes from keeping someone else alive on a very small wage. The daily practice of translating dignity into work. She could decline. She could, for instance, take the paid leave, rest, and continue the old life that fit like a familiar coat. She could stay and keep the rhythm, sleeping at the edge of time, returning to a place that asked for invisibility. Or she could, perhaps, show up and see what a conversation held. Maya let the phone lie in her palm for a long while, feeling its slight heat. Lorraine, laying out a threadbare quilt on the couch, watched her with the patient curiosity of a mother who has lived through many possibility-laden nights. "You going?" she asked. Maya looked at Eli sleeping in the other room and pictured his small body folded in the safety of the bed. The question of safety was not one to be taken lightly. "I don't know," she said. "What if it's one of those changes that sounds good but asks me to leave everything behind?" "Then you say no," Lorraine answered. "But you should look. You are tired of people telling you what you can't have." That line, "Look, don't commit," settled like a stone in Maya's chest. It was permission of a practical sort, the kind that gave agency back. She remembered Eli's face when he bit into the gingerbread, the soft satisfaction that had nothing to do with money. She could not promise him palaces, but she could consider ways to make a small table more real, more frequent. On the bus to Savannah, the city slides past like a slow film. Storefronts, a children's mural with the sun peeling at the paint, a man selling roasted chestnuts at a corner. Maya watched the city and tried to imagine herself walking through it in a different role, not one of service only, but one of responsibility. The folder Mr. Paulson had mentioned sat against her hip, a broadsheet of the Hartman Foundation's outreach programs, glossy and optimistic. Her stomach fluttered with something like fear, and something like a hunger that had lived in her ribs for years. When she walked into the Savannah office, she did so like someone walking into a place that had been designed for people with clean shoes and steady credit histories. The lobby smelled of coffee and civility. Denise was waiting, a woman with a steady smile and hands that moved in quick, decisive gestures. She wore a cardigan that was both practical and kind. When she stood and extended her hand, her palm was warm. "You found the gingerbread," Denise said by way of greeting, and Maya blinked. Maya started, then realized Denise meant something different. "No. I mean, you found yourself here," she corrected gently. "Don't worry, we don't expect miracles. We expect honest conversation." They sat at a table near a plant that had been watered with care. Denise had a notebook, fanned open with the organization's intake forms, but she did not slide them toward Maya. She was interested in a story, not boxes to be ticked. "How long have you worked as a housekeeper?" Denise asked. 10 years, Maya said, "on and off. mostly with houses and sometimes hotels. Since Eli was born, mostly with families. Do you have any experience supervising others? Maya thought of the way she had shown new hires where to store the glassware, the quiet corrections she had given to girls who were afraid of the high plates. I helped train the last woman who started in my kitchen, she said. I showed her how to fold napkins, how to carry the long tray without wobble. Nothing official. Denise's pen did not move. We're piloting a program that identifies staff who show leadership and gives them the tools to become coordinators, jobs that sit between domestic work and administrative oversight. It's about promotion, yes, but also about creating a ladder. Maya listened as if the words were a language she had never studied. The ladder idea was simple: training, paid days, a probationary period where the salary would reflect the shift from menial labor to supervised roles. It was not a one-time rescue. It sounded like a process with checks and balances, training modules, mentorship, a period for assessment. "You're not offering me the world," Maya said after a pause. Her throat tightened. "What if I can't do it?" "We'll teach you," Denise said. "We'll give you a mentor, and we'll pay you for your training time. The first few months are tough, but if you can teach someone else how to do what you do, then you have the most important skill." Maya remembered Eli asking for macaroni. She remembered the way a child's joy could make a woman feel something larger than her own hunger. The thought of stepping into a role that meant being visible, that meant maybe not returning to the kitchen's shadow hours, felt both dangerous and necessary. She asked, because it was the honest question. "Why me?" Denise's face softened the way a light does when it focuses on a single detail. She said, "Because you showed up on that log. Because these programs are meant to notice people who are at risk of slipping between systems. And because the people who staff this program look for people who, when asked to lead, don't ask for glory. They ask for fairness." Maya let the words settle. She did not know if she believed her own courage yet. She did not know whether this was a doorway or a mirror. All she knew was that there was an opening, and she had both the right and the obligation to step through. She left with a folded pamphlet and a date for a follow-up meeting. Denise's assistant walked her to the door with a cup of coffee and a small package of crisps wrapped in a paper napkin. It was a small kindness that felt like a promise. Back at the row house that night, Eli took the crisps and made a face, as if crunching was a new performance. Lorraine hummed in the kitchen. The paid leave money still sat in Maya's pocket like a warm stone. The phone rang, someone from Hartman Domestic Services checking that she had received the stipend, someone from the clinic promising an appointment. The wheels of bureaucracy had turned, quiet and precise. Maya dreamt of a table that night that stretched longer than their small dining room. Around it were women and men from her neighborhood. The woman from the laundromat who had taught her to press collars without fraying their edges. The boy who mowed lawns for spare change and kept his mother's garden alive. A child who had never known a plate that was not chipped, but whose smile was as shining as a new coin. She woke with a tiny, fierce resolve. On a morning that nipped at the glass of the windows with frost, as she dressed for the shift she had not yet decided to leave, a small, polite message came to her phone. It was an invitation, formal and careful, from the Savannah office. An offer to come and shadow a coordinator for a week. It was not a job contract, only a test of fit. She could refuse. She could accept. The counselor in the clinic had recommended physical therapy before a long commute. Lorraine had suggested a plan that would allow her to keep Eli close while training. Morning sessions at the hub, afternoons at home, a staggered schedule. There were negotiations to be had, modifications she would ask for if she stepped forward. Maya sat on the edge of the narrow bed and considered the small, private wish she'd whispered into the dark a few nights earlier. The wish had been simple and tender. A single shared Christmas dinner. A plate for Eli that would feel like they were claiming a place in the holiday, even if they had no stockings with names stitched on them. She folded her hands. She felt not like someone being rescued, but like someone being asked to take the first steps out of a long tunnel. The check and the anonymous note had been a pause granted. Patrick's slip of paper had been a nudge. Denise's open door had been a real institutional hinge. None of it erased the work that would be required. Training, the possibility of awkwardness in a world where she had always been told when to move and how to bow. She thought about staying and folding the possibility into the careful life she had built, about the price of change. She thought of the way her son's small hand had wrapped around the gingerbread, of the way a child's contentment could operate like weather. Small storms needed nothing but to be sheltered. When she told Lorraine, "I'll go for the week," it felt like deciding to test a map she had been given. Lorraine's face split into something like readiness. "Good," she said. "We begin small. We don't move everything at once. We keep Eli where he belongs." And so it began, a tentative step toward a threshold that could be crossed or not. Maya packed a small tote into which she placed a worn notebook, the gingerbread cookie, because some things were too sacred even for cynicism, and the printed schedule from Savannah. She told Eli that she had an appointment, and he, in his child's way, drew a crude chair on a scrap of paper and wrote, "Mommy sits here," in blocky letters. At the office, the first day of shadowing was all small unrealities. An ID badge that felt ill-fitting, a group meeting where the project manager spoke about metrics and participant engagement, a training module that began with a simple line, "Leadership is showing up for the people who will come after you." Maya found herself thinking, not for the first time, that the people who would come after her needed someone who had been in their shoes, someone who had once been the person wiping crumbs from an apron pocket. She watched a coordinator take an intake call and observed the careful balance of boundaries and empathy. The coordinator, Jamira, a woman with a laugh that arrived like sunshine, moved through the room with a kind of practiced ease, offering clients a sense of being both seen and given a plan. Maya watched how a small, precise schedule could change someone's world more reliably than a single large donation. "We're here to build ladders," Jamira said to the room in a tone that made it clear she did not mean metaphors only. "We put down rungs and teach people to climb." When a woman came in late that morning with a story of a stolen paycheck and a child at school with a fever, Maya felt a familiar quickness behind her belly. She remembered Lucille's soft-spoken threats, too, and the way words could become barriers. This, she thought with a sudden hot certainty, is the room that should have me in it. At lunchtime, Denise pulled her aside and asked, tentatively, if she would consider taking a paid pilot position as a trainee coordinator. "We don't want to rush," Denise said. "We want to walk with you. You would be paid, you would have a mentor, and we would adjust your hours so Eli is secure." Maya felt the exact center of her life tilt. She imagined Eli's face at the table, the warm glow of a candle in a room that belonged to them in a small but resolute way. She thought of how to be mother and leader in the same breath without one role consuming the other. "I need time to think," she said, which was true. She was not ready to be the sort of person who walked into commitments without knowing whether the bridge would hold. Denise nodded. "Of course, we want you to decide on your terms." On the bus home, with the office folder pressed against her chest, Maya let herself imagine a version of the future in which she stood in front of a small room of women, teaching them how to count hours and invoices, how to ask for fair breaks, how to sign for payroll. In that future, she could see a table, longer than her current one, maybe not lavish but steady, with plates set and Eli sitting at the head of it like he had always belonged there. She pictured the look on his face when he realized they had managed to carve out something real in a world that measured worth in glass and gilding. She also imagined failing. She imagined the awkwardness of being both the girl who used to wash dishes and the woman who had to tell someone else they were late. That fear kept her honest. It kept the ambition from becoming a fast slide towards self-forgetting. The thought of losing Eli's steady presence for a sudden move for a promotion made her pause. So she met the offer with a condition, a pilot position, local, part-time at first, with the option to scale as they proved the model. The idea felt like a negotiation where both sides measured the weight of consequence. Watching Eli sleep that night, Maya realized she was beginning to understand how agency worked, not as a private victory, but as a series of choices constrained by love and fear and necessity. She had been given a pause and an opening. She would decide, but she would also shape the terms. She slept with the folder under her pillow, which was a ridiculous superstition but felt protective. In the morning, the pain in her shoulder had dulled enough to move without stabbing. Patrick waved from his van as she climbed in. "How'd it go?" he asked. Maya smiled, small and careful. "I'm going to try," she said. "Just try." They drove past the mansion, past the clipped hedges and the staff gate where, last week, she had been ordered to scrub a pantry at midnight. Through the glass, the Hartman house looked no different from any day, as if it hadn't registered that the people who kept it running sometimes needed the house in return. Tobias Hartman, for all his name and power, was far away in a corner office whose windows gave a wide view, but not the whole picture. He was a figure in the institutional story that had just touched her life, not a god descending to right all wrongs, but a man whose organization had mechanisms that could be turned by people like Denise into something practical and steady. Maya's wish, the little whispered thing in the dark, had not been heard by him. It was not the precipitating cause of the sequence that followed. Instead, it had been the small events, the slip, the report, Patrick's gentle insistence that had made a seam in the fabric of her ordinary life. Wishes, she realized, sometimes had to be kept private in order to be honest. They did not always need audience to breathe into possibility. She seated herself into the coming days with a quiet discipline. She would keep Eli's routines. She would test the waters of the new role. She would be present in the place where a ladder might be built for other women like her. She would not accept a narrative in which her life was the before and someone else wrote the after. On the Thursday after her first week of shadowing, she received an email, a formal invitation to a small open house the Savannah office was hosting for local community members who had an interest in the new staff-led initiatives. It was, on paper, ordinary: time, place, a schedule. But for Maya, it was an invitation to enter a story at the point where the audience watches the protagonist choose. She hesitated only a moment before replying that she would attend. The choice felt like threading a needle, small, deliberate, necessary. As she turned out the light that night, she thought of Eli's small hand, the gingerbread's cracked crescent, the anonymous check folded into her pocket. She thought of Denise's careful smile and Patrick's steady eyes. She thought of Lucille's thin, practiced cruelty and how it had sharpened her patience into something new. She did not know if the open house would change her life. She did not know if the pilot would work. She only knew that for the first time in a long time, a door, which had been no more than a smudge of light under a heavy doorframe, had been pulled open enough to step toward it. If this story moved you, please give it a like or share. Small gestures help more stories like this get told. That night, she rehearsed what she might say if someone asked why she wanted to work with other women like her. The answer was simple and true, because someone once taught her how to wrap a perfect napkin, and it had felt like a lesson in dignity. She wanted to hand that lesson forward. The open house came with a small thing she had not expected. A woman named Jamira stood up and, in a room full of folding chairs and community tables, told a story about being taught to keep ledgers. Jamira's talk was short and full of practical detail. It smelled faintly of coffee and old hands and the oxygen of people who had survived things that could have crushed them. She spoke of training that had been honest, not condescending, less about inspiration and more about skills, and how those skills had made steady lives possible. Maya felt in that hearing the kinship. She listened to the sound of her own future in someone else's clear sentences. The Hartman Foundation had not written the blueprint for her life. They had, instead, started to fund a place where people could move themselves forward. Tobias Hartman's name was on the donation ledger, his money funneled through committees and paperwork. It mattered in the way institutions matter, as an enabling force, not a redemptive one. After the meeting, Denise found Maya near the coffee urn and said simply, "When you're ready, we have a training slot next month. You'll have a mentor. Jamira is one of Jamira is one of our best mentors, Denise finished, and the sentence folded into the small room like a promise. She smiled in a way that asked for less courage than what would be required, and Maya felt the weight of possibility settle again, this time less like a map and more like a set of steps she might learn to walk. The training began in a small classroom above the Savannah office, where a radiator clicked and breathed like an old heart. The room smelled of hot tea and chalk dust. For the first week, lessons were mundane and oddly grounding. How to read personnel files without losing compassion, the mechanics of payroll codes, the architecture of a schedule. Jamira taught the modules on interviewing with a fierce tenderness. She corrected Maya's posture when she slumped and modeled ways to say, "I understand," without promising the impossible. Maya learned to fill out intake forms with a precision that felt like prayer. Names, ages, the particulars that turned anonymous struggle into stories that could be tracked and helped. She traced the lines of the organization's workflow and discovered something that stunned her with its simple honesty. The people who built ladders had to measure the rungs. Data would not be glamour. It would be the way budgets and daycare spots and training days were won. Between sessions, she caught herself watching Jamira. Jamira moved like someone who remembered the hunger she used to tuck under her ribs, and her laughter, so present, kept the room from calcifying into pity. At lunch, Jamira told a story about a woman who had kept her sons fed by cobbling together 2 part-time jobs and learning to tend a ledger. "Those numbers give you leverage," Jamira said. "When you can prove a need, you can argue for a resource." Maya copied the phrase into the front page of her notebook, underlining it twice. Outside of the classroom, the body that had ached since the pantry door had gone from a steady complaint to a quiet, manageable ache. The clinic visits helped. A physiotherapist taught Maya how to respect small limits and when to push gently. She learned to ice, to breathe, to ask for help with the heaviest trays. Asking felt strange, not weak, but a new kind of muscle that needed work. At home, she practiced leading in small ways. She set a routine with Eli that was as much about rhythm as homework. A clean plate, a nightly story, a 5-minute conversation about one thing that had gone well in his day. Lorraine watched her from the kitchen doorway as if she were seeing a familiar song take on a new verse. "You're softer on yourself," Lorraine observed one morning, handing Maya a mug of tea. "Maybe that's a part of learning to lead." "Or it's a part of learning to survive with your heart intact," Maya said. Eli ran past, a blur in socks, and whacked a sock puppet into the tea steam. He called out, "Mom, when you get the job, will I be allowed to feed the plants at Rice Center?" "You will be the official plant feeder," Maya answered solemnly, and the small ceremony of a laugh that followed felt like stitches knitting a seam. Maya's first real test came sooner than she expected. Denise asked her to co-lead a community workshop on labor rights, the kind of meeting where mistrust could show up as anger or silence. Maya spent nights writing and rewriting a short talk, not a grand speech, only a few lines about dignity, about rules that should protect people rather than belittle them. She practiced in front of Lorraine until Lorraine clapped at the end, proud. Eli made a poster with the words "May" scrawled in thick marker and taped it to her bag. The workshop was held in a community center with narrow stage lights and folding chairs. Maya felt her hands go cool as she stepped up, but the coolness was steadier than panic. She began by telling a small story about a cracked gingerbread and a child's surprise, and she felt the room lean. She didn't make it a parable of victimhood. She named routines, schedules, and the ways rules could erase a name. "Dignity," she said plainly, "isn't a luxury. It's a cost and a right. We teach people how to take it back by giving them tools." When she finished, a woman at the back with tired hair raised her hand and said, simply, "Can you teach me how to put it on paper?" The question unstitched a space in Maya's jaw that let empathy out. That moment, when someone asked for the mechanics, not the sermon, was the hinge. The applause that followed felt modest but solid. Word travels in small, practical ways. Reports compiled by the Savannah office recorded the number of people who attended the workshops, the percentage who completed a follow-up session, the ratio of those who found stable daytime work. The Hartman Foundation's metrics team, careful and slightly remote, noticed an uptick when Maya's cohort piloted a scheduling tool that reduced emergencies among staff by 30%. Tobias Hartman received the quarterly summary as one of many pages in a board packet. He was a man who read numbers for their human shape, and the data made him curious. He asked Denise during a staff briefing to tell him more about the promising pilot. Denise told him about mentors and attendants, and she described a woman, Maya, who had become a hinge in her neighborhood. He did not arrive at the open house because of a whispered wish. He arrived months later after meetings and briefings and his own conversations with strategic staff. He arrived because institutions, when nudged by data and the quiet work of people like Denise, choose to look closer. He entered the room in a suit that made him appliance cool against the low hum of chairs and conversation. He stood near the back with a name tag that read "Guest" and listened. Maya was on the small stage that afternoon because Denise had backed her and because Jamira had insisted she take the lead. The room was crowded. Women who had never believed committees could be kind, men from construction sites, single fathers, a few college students who volunteered. A string of holiday lights gave the ceiling a friendlier curve. Maya did not think about being watched by anyone in particular. She thought of Eli and the way a child's satisfaction can be a compass. Her talk that day had a steadiness she hadn't expected. She spoke about ladders, about rungs, and the people who hold them steady. She spoke about the ways households divided labor, and how those divisions could be renegotiated, through contracts, through paid training, through simple things like predictable time off. "We will teach people to ask for what they need," she said. "We will teach managers to listen. We will teach communities to keep their own lights on." The sentences widened in her mouth like paths. When she finished, the room sang into applause. It was not the roaring acclaim of a celebrity, just a warm recognition that someone had used words to make a plan. A local reporter from the Savannah Gazette asked to speak with her afterward. Then another volunteer took her aside and asked if she would help start a neighborhood registry of reliable childcare providers. It felt like small dominoes aligning. Tobias watched from the perimeter. He had not come to perform compassion. He had come because the landscape of his foundation's work had changed, and the data suggested that different investments might yield durable returns. He listened to Maya and, for the first time, felt something like respect that did not originate in pity. That distinction mattered to him. It would shape how he acted. He asked Denise for a briefing and then arranged for a formal meeting with Maya, through Denise, where the agenda was clear: how to scale this approach without erasing local leadership. The RISE project took shape in committee rooms over many weeks: budgets, pilot sites, job descriptions. Tobias authorized seed funding, but insisted on structures: independent oversight, community advisory councils, and a governance model that ensured local leaders had veto powers over the design. Maya read every draft they offered and marked places she thought might replicate the very dynamics she was trying to change. She insisted that the center's board include a majority of local residents and that staff be hired from within the program when possible. Tobias supported those stipulations not because he was humbled by a fairy tale redemption, but because he had come to understand leverage. Money without local ownership would be blunted. Money with it could multiply. As momentum mounted, so did tensions. Lucille heard about the RISE project through the servants' ledger, and, with an impulsiveness that had the stamp of both fear and regret, applied for a position stirring behind the scenes: a restorative track designed for staff who needed retraining and reintegration. The application landed on Maya's desk with a note appended: "Request reviewed by HR. Please advise." Maya's stomach folded in on itself when she recognized Lucille's name. The memory of the kitchen, of crumbs flicked across her apron, reappeared with a heat that called for either retaliation or restraint. Maya asked Denise to bring the case to the advisory committee, a body of neighbors, mentors, and a representative from the Hartman administrative team. They convened in a small conference room. Lucille came, not as the imperious figure from the mansion, but as a woman who sat rigidly in a chair that was too small for her shoulders. Her eyes were not averted. That surprised Maya. There was a tremor in her voice when she spoke. "I did what I thought the house needed," Lucille said. "I kept standards. I did the work I was paid for." "What about the way you spoke to people?" a committee member asked. "What about the woman you disciplined?" Lucille's eyes landed on Maya. For a moment, neither woman could look away from the other. The air between them was quiet in a way that had to be honored. Lucille's face moved through a few registers: defiance, denial, then a slow, uneasy folding into reflection. "I have not been gentle," she said. "I have been strict because I believed that was what kept the house together. I see now I used the rules to keep myself safe, and it hurt people. I am sorry for that." The advisory committee did not accept a verbal apology as the end of it. Maya insisted on a path that would hold Lucille accountable and also allow restoration if she met concrete conditions. The plan included training courses at the RISE project, a set number of supervised service hours assisting with community kitchens and childcare, a formal restorative conversation with those she had humiliated, and ongoing supervision for a year. Lucille agreed to each term. There would be no immediate reinstatement to managerial positions in domestic settings. The committee feared repeating cycles. Maya herself agreed to personally oversee parts of the process, a decision that cost her emotionally, but felt consistent with the ethic she was trying to build: forgiveness coupled with structural change. The restorative conversation, held in a neutral room with a facilitator, was less dramatic than the city papers might have wanted. Lucille spoke first, not to be theatrical, but because the space required specificity. "When I flicked crumbs onto your apron," she said to Maya, "it was to show power. I see now how small and terrible that was for you." Lucille's apology included action plans. She would record her hours at the center, enroll in conflict resolution classes, and accept feedback. Maya listened. The old humiliation had left a scar, but she also recognized that rigid roles were often shaped by fear. "I accept accountability," she told Lucille, "and I accept that restoration, if earned, has to be through work that benefits others." Lucille's first weeks at the RISE project were awkward and honest. She learned how to make a casserole for 30 and how to trim a budget for a lunch program. She received feedback she had not had to hear when authority was automatic. On a cold morning, when a bus of children arrived for after-school care and the staff needed 2 extra hands to manage coats and snack distribution, Lucille stepped forward without ordering and became useful in a new register. People noticed. Not everyone forgave immediately, but small trust accrued in small acts. Maya's relationship with Tobias developed in parallel with these institutional rhythms: formal meetings, planning committees, and a small number of shared, carefully arranged meals where policy and people intersected. They met first because strategy required it, and in those early conversations, Tobias learned to listen beyond numbers. He asked honest, sometimes awkward questions. "How do we avoid displacing local leaders?" he asked. "How do we know our scale won't erode what you're building?" Maya framed a pragmatic answer: start slow, measure, and, crucially, pay local leaders a living wage. She laid out a pilot that would first fund 3 local hubs and use an apprenticeship model to staff them. Tobias agreed to the pilot on condition that the foundation's board kept a hands-off approach to daily operations. He showed his support by establishing a seed grant with clear governance lines and a transparent reporting structure. He did not walk in and remake the program with his name on the door. Instead, he sat in a conference room and read minutes and listened as Maya advocated for people he might never have noticed otherwise. There was a quiet chemistry in those meetings that could have threatened clarity. Respect could slip into something more intimate if not checked. Both of them recognized the risk. Maya insisted that any personal connection be navigated with full transparency. When Tobias suggested hosting a fundraising dinner, Maya said no. She proposed a panel where the money could be discussed publicly. Tobias respected the boundary. He began to see that honoring power differentials meant smaller, more disciplined gestures, bringing organizational expertise, connecting the RISE project to other nonprofits, and stepping back when community leaders needed to lead. As the pilot proved itself, offers arrived. A national labor equity group invited Maya to be a speaker at a regional summit in Chicago. The invitation was flattering and terrifying, an affirmation she hadn't asked for but could not easily refuse. It also came with strings, the expectation of travel and months away from Eli. Denise mentioned the role in passing at a staff meeting, and Tobias, who had heard her speak, offered to underwrite travel and a temporary substitute for home. Maya sat with Lorraine over a pot of soup and tried to measure the right decision. "They want you to go national," Lorraine said. "That's huge." Maya thought of Eli tucking a tiny paper chair into his drawings and insisted on the anchor. "If I go away for months, Eli won't be at the table for all of this," she said. "I refuse to be the kind of leader who builds wings on someone else's shoulders by leaving my child behind." They negotiated. Rather than accept a full-time national role that required relocation, Maya proposed a different structure to Tobias and the board. A regional director position that would allow her to scale the model while keeping leadership rooted locally. She recommended a deputy who could represent the program nationally and asked for funding to build a remote training hub in their city. The compromise honored her priorities: impact without sacrifice of daily motherhood. Tobias respected the decision. When he called to say the foundation approved her model, his voice carried something like relief. "We want you to lead in a way that fits your life," he said. "Tell us what you need to make that sustainable." She told him. Childcare stipends for trainees, a small emergency fund, and real salaries for local leaders. He agreed. It was a pragmatic partnership, money aligned to infrastructure, not magnanimity. That kind of alignment changed the tenor of their interactions. He became an ally who could wield influence to open doors, not a rescuer who would write a check and vanish. The RISE project's first hub opened in a refurbished laundromat with fairy lights and a new coat of paint. Volunteers donated old sofas, and a woman from the church brought potted herbs. The toolbox of offerings, childcare matching, training modules on workplace rights, bookkeeping classes, arrived as a menu rather than a sermon. Jamira ran a course teaching practical skills, tallying receipts, reading a payroll stub, negotiating a break time. Jira, another mentee, ran a pop-up childcare that allowed mothers to attend training modules. She was a young woman with a patient way of shepherding toddlers and a knack for improvising snacks. In her first week, she taught a group of mothers a simple game to teach children about sharing, and the mothers applauded as if it were an innovation. Maya's time splintered into many small rooms: intake interviews, late nights compiling grant proposals, community cookouts where she learned to listen without taking over. She found ways to practice leadership that were not theatrical: acknowledging a volunteer in a meeting, sending a note to a mentee who had missed a session, refusing to let a funder demand programmatic changes without community assent. The ascension moment, the public articulation of what had been built, came at a regional summit where Maya had been asked to speak about the apprenticeship model. The auditorium in Chicago hummed with energy. The stage lights made the audience faces anonymous. She walked out and felt the familiar chill in her hands. But the stiffness was different now. Her voice moved from small sentences to broader cadences as she told the story of ladders and rungs and of how dignity required measurable supports. "Leadership," she said, "is the practice of being useful to someone who cannot yet see the ladder at the top of the shaft. It doesn't make you less of a mother to lead. It makes you more honest about what leadership should look like." The applause was generous. After the talk, a line formed, a practical line of human faces with specific needs and offers: a city councilor who wanted to fund a similar pilot, a university professor who offered to research their outcomes, and a small tech startup that wanted to donate scheduling software. Maya felt the gravity of responsibility, the slow multiplication of choices. She began to see the architecture of a scalable model, community hubs, funded fellowships, and a leadership ladder that moved people from pantry work to paid coordinating positions. But the journey still demanded small reckonings. One evening, after a whirlwind of planning calls, Maya returned home to find Eli waiting with a paper chain of stars he'd made. "For the dinner," he announced, "Christmas dinner." His certainty was a tether. Maya felt the ache of being pulled between two worlds, the long meetings that would keep the lights on and the small chair at her own table. She proposed a plan instead of a choice. She would attend an important strategy session the week before Christmas, but would schedule the big community dinner for Christmas Eve, timed so she could be present. It required negotiation with funders and staff, and Denise promised to lead the final meeting in her stead. The model had been built on the premise that leadership could be shared, and Maya intended to live by that value. As the Rise Center's opening approached, small miracles of logistics aligned. A local church offered a kitchen for the opening dinner, a hardware shop donated shelving, and Patrick, whose steady kindness had always been a quiet buoy, volunteered the van for transporting goods. Tobias attended the ribbon cutting with a cautious modesty, speaking about partnership rather than philanthropy. He made sure checks were signed, that the governance clauses were respected, and that the board included local leaders with real authority. He did not seek the spotlight. He stepped back when Maya stood at the podium to speak. Her opening remarks were not a victory lap. She recounted practicalities, talking about how many people had been trained, how many part-time jobs had been converted into full-time positions, and the small metrics that mattered: days of paid leave created, emergency funds dispersed. The audience responded with a warmth that had less to do with spectacle than recognition. Jamira and Jira stood to her side, smiling. After the speeches, food circulated in a generous hush. There were plates of rice and beans, pies, and a pot roast that smelled like holiday and hope. Lucille moved through the crowd, carrying a tray and receiving glances that ranged from cautious to curious. She had completed her service hours and was still under supervision, but she had earned the right to be present. At the edge of the hall, Maya watched her and remembered the small cruelty of the kitchen. Accountability, she had learned, was not a single act, but a long set of practices. When Lucille approached Maya, her hands trembled slightly. "I want to help," she said, simple and direct. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to be part of making this place safe." Maya took a breath. She thought of all the times she had chosen restraint instead of retaliation. She had not forgiven because forgiveness erased harm. She had forgiven because the community could be stronger if restoration were possible under firm conditions. "Come work the serving line today," Maya said, "and keep the clipboard for the next month. We'll review it together." The exchange was pragmatic, the sort of small covenant that might, over time, alter the tenor of a person who had relied on authority as armor. Christmas Eve arrived like a promise kept. The Rise Center had arranged a modest celebration. A long table, mismatched chairs, candlelight, and a sign that read, hand-painted, "All are welcome." Maya set a place not as a symbol, but as a practice. Elias sat beside Lorraine, sticky fingers claiming the corner of his napkin. The room was full of the faces that had gathered throughout Maya's life. Jamira with her easy smile, Jira wiping a child's nose with professional grace, Denise sharing a laugh with a counselor, Patrick moving quietly behind the scenes. Tobias stood near the back, holding a cup of coffee, and watching not like a man who had performed a benevolent act, but like one who had been taught to see what infrastructure could do. Maya moved between the tables, making sure plates were full and conversation started. She sat down opposite Eli and watched him eat with an attention that was both routine and rare. Fatherhood is made of small rituals, she had learned. She felt the presence of many people who had helped, but the circle at her table was intimate enough that gratitude could be specific.
"You helped me with the lights," Eli told Jamira, pointing. Jamira ruffled his hair and handed him a small paper star she had made during the afternoon program. The first course passed in comfortable clatter. At one point, a young mother across from Maya looked at her with no pretense. "How did you do it?" she asked, less curious than seeking, a way to ask for instructions in living. Maya thought of the steps, the anonymous check that had bought 2 weeks' rest, Patrick's slip of paper with Denise's name, the classes and the mentors, the vow to hold people accountable without erasing them. "It started with one small thing. Someone noticed," she said. "Then we built the rest. We measured, we trained, we set boundaries, and we shared the work."
She smiled and added, "Also, never underestimate a good sheet of napkins." There was laughter, then a low, easy conversation about job openings, apprenticeships, and the ridiculous joys of imperfect pies. Tobias found a way to approach the table without making his presence into a headline. He sat a respectful distance away and offered a toast that recognized local leadership. "To people who show up for each other," he said, "to leaders who make ladders for others." Maya raised her glass. She felt the years of careful accumulation, of small kindnesses, of institutional insistence, of personal choices, settle into a quiet, durable shape. She did not see Tobias as the origin of the movement, but as a lever. She had used that lever to lift many, not to replace her own hands. That night, after the last dish had been cleared and the candles had burned low, Maya washed a plate and placed it to dry. Eli brushed his teeth and climbed into bed, the small stuffed bear tucked under his arm. He asked sleepily, "Did we have our Christmas dinner, Mommy?" "We did," she replied. Her voice was soft. "We had our dinner." He stretched an arm from under the covers and asked, as only a child could, "Will we have it again next year?" Maya thought of budgets and schedules and the slow work of growing a center that could stand on its own. She thought of the apprentices who would learn, the parents who would find care, the volunteers who would stay because the work felt honest. "Yes," she said, without hubris, "we will. We'll make sure there's a table every year." She walked back downstairs and found Lorraine at the kitchen sink, hands in suds. The two of them stood in companionable silence for a moment, the hum of the neighborhood a low lullaby. Maya placed her hands in the warm water and let the suds carry away the crumbs of the day. "You did all right," Lorraine said. "We did," Maya corrected. The center's lights glowed softly in the distance like a small constellation. She thought of how wishes sometimes operated quietly, not as magical requests, but as the impetus for choices that ripple. Her whispered wish, kept private in the dark, had not been heard by a billionaire in a hallway. It had been honored by a set of human systems, responding to a reporting line, to a steward's empathy, to a manager's insistence that programs be accountable. The machinery of change was clunky and imperfect, but it worked when people insisted on dignity and measured the results. Weeks later, a profile in a regional magazine titled "From Apron to Action" told the story of the RISE project and quoted Maya on the moral economy of labor. Tobias was mentioned, not as a savior, but as a funder who had learned to step back. The story included a photograph of Maya and Jamira in front of the center, smiling with the messy, beautiful fullness of people who had found, in each other, the grit to continue. The months that followed were not a crescendo to finality, but a steady notes. The RISE Center hired a small, paid staff, most of them graduates of the program. Jamira became a lead trainer. Jira's pop-up childcare expanded into a licensed cooperative. Lucille, still under supervision, became a steady presence in the kitchen, and later, after continued training, an assistant coordinator for the meals program. Tobias continued to attend meetings, but insisted on listening, on being educated by the people who did the work. He wrote a check now and then, but more often he connected the center to policy forums where their model could be studied, replicated, and funded responsibly. Maya's life settled into a rare harmony. She was mother and leader in equal measure.
There were still evenings when exhaustion knocked her down, when a grant application dragged late into the night and Eli tugged a blanket across her knees. There were crises, a sudden heating repair at the center, a funding gap that demanded fast negotiation, but fewer than there might have been without the systems built around care. On a raw March morning, Maya stood in a classroom watching a group of women learn to track hours and create invoices. One of them, a woman named Rosa, read aloud a ledger entry and then laughed, bright and incredulous. "I did this," she said. "I wrote it, and it makes sense." The laughter was small, but it was a herald. Years from the cracked gingerbread, on a Christmas that smelled of cinnamon and old books, Maya sat at a long table with Eli at her side. The scene was not a miracle placed upon her, but a circle of earned work. Across from her, Luke, the man who had once carried logs in the neighborhood and now taught basic carpentry in the apprenticeship program, passed the mashed potatoes. Lucille, with a steady hand and soft eyes, served the dessert. Tobias, present as a guest and friend, quietly refilled a glass before stepping back into the warmth of the room. At one point, Eli rose on his toes and reached for the center of the table where a small plate of gingerbread crescents, baked by volunteers, waited. He looked at Maya and, in that small, luminous way children have, said, "Mom, remember when you brought one for me?" Maya's throat tightened. The memory was not sanctified by magic, but by the accumulation of decisions. She had carried that cusp of longing through many rooms, turning it into designs and programs that made space for others to carry their own. Later, as the evening wound down and volunteers cleared plates, people lingered in small conversations. Jamira and Jira planned a new workshop. Rosa hugged Maya and asked whether she could bring 2 more friends next time. Lorraine leaned against a doorway and watched her daughter with an expression that could not be summarized in words. Maya thought of the path that had led her here. She thought of humility, of the small acts of kindness that had mattered. Patrick's paper slip, a folded check, a public program that respected data and dignity. She thought of the decision that had kept her child at home while still allowing her to grow. She thought of Lucille and the hard labor of accountability. She thought of Tobias and the way institutional money could be wielded in ways that increased agency rather than erased it. She wanted the table to be larger, to hold more people, more stories, more hands to pass plates. The Rise project had grown, but its heartbeat remained the same, ladders made of rungs people could climb. Maya finished her tea and felt the soft certainty of someone who had stewarded something fragile into form. As the night wound down, she stood in the doorway and watched Eli chase a paper star he had found under a chair. He was laughing with a certainty that belonged to children. His joy had never been contingent on a single night. She felt gratitude, not because someone had rescued her, but because a network of people had chosen to treat dignity as an investment. If you want to learn more about the Rise Project and how to support local mentorship initiatives like it, check the link in the description below. Support can look like volunteering, donating to community funds, or simply sharing a story that honors dignity and practical change. Maya turned off the kitchen light and took Eli's small hand for the short walk upstairs, the two of them silhouetted in the quiet. At the door, she leaned down and kissed his forehead. "We'll have this again next year," she whispered, not as a promise of magic, but as a commitment built of choices. Eli mumbled in sleep, but kept his grip on her finger. Outside, somewhere in the neighborhood, the Rise Center's lights glowed steady into the night, the small, practical beacon of a community that had learned to build ladders together.